Hello and welcome to today's webinar. We're happy you could join us. My name is Nia Hyde and I'm the Marketing Assistant for K-12 Education Products here at Brooks Publishing. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. You'll be muted for the webinar, but if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box. We'll take these questions after the presentation during the Q&A portion of the webinar. For the presentation, you might want to minimize the GoToWebinar bar on your monitor so you can see more of your screen. You can do that by clicking the orange button with the arrow in the top corner of the control bar. If you need to enlarge the bar again to ask the question, you can just click the orange button again. If you experience any audio issues at any point, you can switch to phone by clicking in the audio section of the webinar panel and using the dial-in information provided. Also, we are recording this webinar. Everyone who registered for the event will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow.
It's not advancing.
There we go. During today's presentation, Dyane Carrere will reference content from her new book, The Reset Process, Trauma-Informed Behavior Strategies. Developed by two seasoned authors or educators who specialize in trauma-informed teaching, The Reset Process is a neuroscience-based approach to improving behavioral success in children from grades K through 8. This four-step process is structured yet flexible, refined through nearly a decade of field testing, and easy to integrate into any individual's teacher's classroom or an entire school's student support system. Blending best practices from behavioral approaches, mindfulness practices, and trauma-informed care, the Reset Process not only addresses behavior, but also guides schools in meeting the neurological and attachment needs of dysregulated students, reducing barriers to social and academic success. This book is a vital resource for classroom teachers, school counselors, administrators, and other professional support personnel. To learn more about the book, you can visit the URL that is shown on your screen. I'm also happy to announce that Brooks will be giving away 3 copies of Dyane Carrere's book, The Reset Process. Winners will be randomly selected from today's live attendees and notified by email after the webinar. To increase your chances, be sure to submit your questions in the questions pane throughout the presentation. Also, we did want to mention at the end of the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a short survey. We'd love to know what you thought of the webinar, and anyone who completes this survey will also be entered to win a copy of Dyane's book. Everyone watching this webinar will be able to download a certificate of attendance. For those of you watching live, you can download your certificate from the handouts pane. Live attendees will also be emailed their certificate in the next 24 hours. For those of you who are watching this webinar as a recording, stay tuned to the end of today's webinar to learn how to access your certificate. Without further delay, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Spanning more than 40 years, Dyane Lewis Carrere's career in education has taken many forms: teacher, administrator, adjunct, faculty member, consultant, and staff developer. Throughout this time, her work has concentrated on supporting students whose struggles have placed them at the fringes of school success. Dyane has worked in preschool through secondary settings, as well as with families and service agencies focusing on developing compassionate, creative, effective behavior supports. She has both taught and been a guest speaker at the college level, bringing her lens on behavior to pre-service educators and master's level educators. During the last 15 years of her career, Dyane has focused on supporting schools in understanding trauma and developing practices that support students with trauma histories. She has shared this work with others through local, state, and national forums. Dyane, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Naya, and thanks to all of you who are out there as we explore. Okay, let me start over. A little tech glitch there. Okay, so I initially designed this process based upon, as you've heard the word many times now, neuroscience of stress and trauma as a way to address students who are experiencing significant struggles in the classroom, whether that's through their focus or struggling with their bodies, with their relationships, with their emotions. But very quickly, though, I realized, along with my teacher colleagues, that it had applicability as a whole class practice, and one that brought increased calm and focus to everyone. And that's the form of the reset process we're going to examine today. Our intent is to give you a strategy that will help your students in this increased time of stress for all of us, whether we are back in physical classrooms or working through virtual formats, that we are able to de-stress and be focused more on our learning tasks. Let me step back for a moment, though, and give you the big picture. The reset process is a strategy that has a core structure, but it also has many different forms that vary in their intensity. It can be proactive, and it also can be reactive. And obviously, we want to put most of our energy into proactive forms, just like this whole class one. It can be implemented with individual students, with small groups of students, or, as in the case of the form we're exploring today, with the whole classroom. Some of the forms are individually guided and some are adult guided. The ones that are individually guided often have been pre-taught with an adult, and they will have guiding visuals that support a student moving through it. And like most effective trauma-informed practices, Reset has proven to not only be helpful with students with the greatest or most intense needs, but it's also been a wonderful universal or tier 1 practice. Each form has its own unique nuances in order to meet the needs of the student or student that is engaged in the process. But they all forms have the core steps that you're going to become familiar with in our time today as we explore this proactive, adult-guided whole group form. So we know that prior to COVID-19, our classrooms had students with a whole range of experiences. We had some with low life stress and others with very intense stress or trauma, and all experiences in between. We also know as educators, we were juggling a lot and we were carrying our own stress. Then COVID-19 hit, and for most people, we adults and our students alike, stress kind of exploded. So how does this stress impact us? When stress chemicals course through our brains and bodies, there are specific changes that occur. Our vision centers become more active and our auditory centers become less active, which means we see more and we hear less. Our emotional parts of our brain take control and our cognitive portions take a back seat. So what happens? We're not as effective in generating language or processing language of others. We tend to rely heavily on visual cues, and we take things in a much more emotional manner. I want you to think about a time you've been stressed. And did you actually feel your normal vocabulary almost slipping away from you? Did you find you needed something repeated several times, or that you needed more time in order to process it, to get it? That's the impact of stress. Additionally, stress impacts our bodies, and our body is on go. What I mean by that is that our body system, our heart, our circulatory, respiratory, skeletal, and muscular systems gear up for some sort of action. We feel jittery, we may feel the need to move. We also know that in times of high stress, the parts of our brain responsible for sensing time and sequence, as well as our awareness of where our body is in space, tend to go offline or not be as tuned in as they typically are. I want you to think again about a stressful time, and for me, I think about those first weeks of COVID. Didn't you feel like you were in some sort of time warp at times? I know for myself, I would think about something and I would think, my gosh, was that 2 days ago or 2 weeks ago? There were times, and you may have experienced this yourself, where I felt apart from my body, kind of felt drifty, out of sync with my body and the world around me. That is the impact of having excess stress chemicals in your body and brain. So the reset process is designed to return balance to your brain and body systematically and efficiently, and that's key. It matches our stressed out systems where they are, and it helps to return them to homeostasis, a place where we're better able to relate and better able to learn. Now, as a proactive practice, if you're doing this routinely, hopefully the bodies and brains of your students aren't as extremely out of sync. But even if they are only mildly dysregulated, mildly distressed, going through this practice helps to return them to a state of focus, and that's valuable to all of us. And beyond that, for our kids, as we practice this, they develop a healthy way to calm down and to refocus. And that's a critical life skill for all of us, and especially for students who are growing up in this time of such great distress. Now, as healthy adults, we may find ourselves having gone through this reset almost naturally, many of the steps of it. And I want you to think about a time that perhaps you were stressed out and you were running to a meeting, but you took a moment, a couple moments, to maybe go for a walk, go get a cup of coffee, take a few breaths, and jot a note or two down of your key points for the meeting. If you did that, I would venture to say that you moved through a natural reset, at least 3 of the 4 steps. You moved your body, you walked, you modulated down, you took your breaths, you probably skipped step 3, we'll talk about that a little more later, and then you landed on step 4, which was you made a plan for the meeting. As a result of those 1 or 2 minutes and those few activities, you probably did much better in that meeting than if you had simply rushed in the door and sat down. So now let's turn to thinking about our kids. What if we could use the same 3 to 5 minute process that allowed you to be more successful to allow them to come to their learning activities more focused and more settled? And honestly, 3 to 5 minutes is all it takes. In fact, I like to be very short with it because I'm more comfortable as an educator doing it more often for short periods of time than less often for longer periods of time. What that allows us to do is it creates calm and focus across the whole of the day. And there is a science behind each of the steps and why they're placed in the order that they are. If you're interested more in the science, I'd encourage you to look at the work of people like Dr. Bruce Perry, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, and there are many others. So let's look at step 1, move your body. We're using gross motor activity to burn off the cortisol that's in your brain and the adrenaline in your body. Gross motor is the most effective and efficient way to rid your body of those excess stress chemicals. Not only that, we have deliberately picked certain specific kinds of physical movements that also introduce dopamine, which is a calming chemical. And that is the next bonus. So we bring down the stress chemicals, bring up the calming chemicals. When we think about those specific activities, we know that a great resource are occupational therapists. And if there are any of you listening, shout out to you guys because you've impacted this process significantly. OTs, by their set of skills and background, are great resources for identifying the kinds of activities that we should be doing in step 1. In step 2, modulate down, we continue to burn off those stress chemicals and introduce calming chemicals through techniques such as more controlled gross motor, fine motor, tuning into our senses, and tuning into our breath. If you're someone who has paid attention to mindfulness practices, this is where they intersect with the concept of reset. For our students, teaching them how to smoothly move from a more active state, a busy state, to a calmer, more focused state is that critical skill that's going to allow them to match the demands of the world outside of them better, which will allow them to have greater success. Step 3, activate thinking. This is the one that if we're pretty good at settling ourselves, we may have jumped over, but I would encourage you to always do this step with students and for yourself, if you're doing it for yourself, if you're highly stressed. It's really important. In this step, we activate our thinking in a non-threatening way. Essentially, we are warming up our brains to be in a calmer state. We are helping them begin to move to that cognitive place. It's not unlike a runner who just stretches before their run. We do something simple that gets the cognitive part of our brain back into gear. In fact, what we're doing is we're having the sugars that allow our brain to function well rise up to our cortex. Finally, in step 4, we begin thinking about what we need to do next, and we begin to do something toward that next thing. As we make a plan, it creates some behavioral momentum. We begin that first step in what will be the next process, the next activity, and that helps us move forward. It also provides an opportunity for us to get a sense of organization around our next step, which is going to allow us to be more planful. So the whole class proactive reset is about taking our students through these 4 steps in a very planful, systematic way. So now that you have a general sense of the 4 steps, we're going to actually look at some specific guidance about how to approach this whole tone of reset and how we're going to engage in it with our students. Of course, we should introduce it very positively, not as we're having so much trouble that we need to reset. Rather, this is a really great skill we can all use. And in fact, I use it in my life. So go in with positivity and then share the purpose. So the purpose is it allows us to focus so we can be better learners, so we can be better friends, so we can be better community members. We should also do it very routinely, because routine, especially during stressful times like now, helps us to be calmer. When we make it a routine part of the life of our classroom, whether that's in person or virtually or both if we're hybrid, we help the brain settle because it knows what's coming. Obviously, we want to make it interesting so that we engage our students. And we do that a lot through our own enthusiasm about it and our participation in it and the model that we are for it. Now, if you are doing this virtually, you might find that older students may want to be off camera during the first 2 steps where there's physical activity. And I think granting them that is very, very important for buy-in. Some students, in fact, may not even engage. They may simply want to watch, and that's perfectly okay. We know from the science of mirror neurons that even just watching a thing helps us to have a bit of practice of it in our brains. We also know that watching helps us kind of emotionally prepare for engaging in the task at a later point. It's creating a sense of safety. For those children who aren't feeling safe immediately doing it, it gives them a chance to become safe with it. Now, for the first 2 steps, counting is really critical. I'll explain more about that in a minute or 2. We also want to keep our language minimal. We want to avoid being super talky, kind of the opposite of what I'm doing now. We want to remember that language for a highly stressed child or adult or young person is not, their language centers aren't at their optimum, functioning at their optimum. So if we talk a lot, we tend to just be an irritant. We're kind of a mosquito buzzing in their ear. So we want to stay away from it, keep it minimal, and use a lot of the visual that is powerful and that the body's tuned into. We also want to use a voice that is warm and engaging, but we don't want to get too wildly animated. So there's this balance between enthusiasm and over hyping things up. So we want to make sure that we have kind of a calm persona, but an interesting persona. Obviously, in person, we want to consider social distancing needs as we move. And we also want to think about the use of personal rather than communal property as we may choose our activities in which we're going to engage students. In our virtual settings, we want to make sure that our tone and our model is even more critical in order to bring our students along with us in the process. And all of us teaching online now know how important that animation and engagement is in the more distance provided through virtual settings. Okay, so this is probably what you've been waiting for, the specifics, the details. In step 1, we're going to be doing activities like this. We're going to be doing wall push-ups, chair push-ups, lunges, rising up on your toes, etc. These were all selected very specifically for the things that they do for our bodies. And what they do is they help us think in terms of pattern, deep pressure, and rhythm. They allow us, when we count, to move to that pattern. And they also introduce some sort of deep pressure into both or either our hips or our shoulder joints. And that's something that OTs and neurologists have taught us release dopamine. You may have already had students that use weighted blankets or weighted backpacks or had a weighted diet throughout their school day. This is working out of that same science. So when we count, we support the rhythm and the pattern, and that's soothing to the brain. Think about the activity of rocking. Rocking shows, that is a very soothing activity. We're going for that same type of thing. But there's another bonus here when we count and we move in rhythm with one another, and it's from the value of synchronicity. Research shows that when we move in tandem with others, we actually bond with them. And that's a very valuable thing in these times when relationships have become a little more tentative because we're not seeing each other as much, or we're not seeing all of our faces all the time. So any way that we can enhance bonding certainly has to be valuable in this COVID era. There are some cautions I want to say about step one. And the first is, be sure to pick activities that you believe are well within your students' physical skill set. It is not calming to struggle with a physical activity. That only leads to more stress. Simpler is better. And students don't need a huge range of different options. You can just pick a few and rotate through them. You can even give students a choice, do this or do that, and follow me to account, so that we build in that choice, which is a safety element. But having that routine and having the few things that we go to is not unlike how we read a story over and over and over to a toddler at bedtime, or how an Olympic athlete, just before they begin their actual performance, will have a specific breathing or movement routine. So, and secondly, we want to avoid any activity and never use anything that is an action that is aggressive in nature. So kicking or punching the air. I know we've probably all experienced, either said it ourselves or had somebody say it to us during a time of stress. Take a deep breath. We may have even said it to ourselves. But here's the thing. It's not necessarily the most effective thing to do. We need to make sure that we understand breath and that we understand catharsis. I want to pop back to the aggressive piece too. If we have done things or have encouraged things that are aggressive, we are having a student do things that are training their brain to become aggressive. I know, we've heard about catharsis. It is counterproductive. We don't have time to look at all the research now and explore it, but the research does clearly indicate that if we pair a state of discomfort or dysregulation with an aggressive act of any sort, we're teaching the brain how to be aggressive in response to stress. So that old punch the pillow instead of a person thing is not good. Likewise, we also want to avoid any language that has aggression to it. So if we're doing wall push-ups with the students, we should not say, push like you want the wall to push over. We should instead say, feel your body moving closer to the wall and your arms bend. Now feel your body move away from the wall and your arms extend. We want to emphasize the physical, not the aggressive. Bottom line is, aggressive words create aggressive thoughts, create aggressive responses to feeling stressed. So typically for step one, I'm going to use 1 or 2 different movements to a count of 10 for a total of 4 repetitions. So 4 sets of 10. And that might be 4 sets of the same thing, or 2 of one thing and 2 of another. Now we're moving into modulating down. You're now going to guide your students through a couple of these activities presented in the order of how the body settles. So we move from gross motor to fine motor to senses to breath. That's how our body settles. Your choices include those things. So gross motor might be things that you see on your screen, like going from arm circles that are larger and fast to arm circles that are smaller and more precise, or doing that same lunge leg movement, but now holding it in a deeper bend. Fine motor activities might be fiddle object practice, or it might be touching your thumb to each one of your fingers while you count, the tips of your fingers. It also might be doing something as simple as taking a pen or a pencil and rolling it from the palm of your hand up to the tips of your hands. A brief aside, I want to talk a little bit about stress balls, because we often think when we see fiddle object, let's give kids a stress ball. Well, they're not a good idea. And first, when we think about balls and we think about students, we know what they're likely to do, right? But secondly, most students will put more energy into squeezing a stress ball, and that is an activating or revving up of the neurological system. So they'll squeeze and squeeze and squeeze, and then they'll let go, and they'll squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. They're actually, instead of settling their system, they are revving their system. The only way to use a stress ball effectively if it's squeezed briefly and the emphasis is on the release, which is super hard with the majority of traditional stress balls. I do encourage people that want fiddle objects and ones that are like stress balls to look into things like koosh balls or balls that have the netting over them, and you can squeeze the bubbles out through the netting and then slowly release those bubbles to return into the ball. That really helps students emphasize the release, and then we're getting the payoff that we want from the fiddle object. If we have a chance during the Q&A and we're on camera, I'll try to show you a few of these. The next way our body settles, a little bit harder than the initial gross motor ones and the fine motor, is tuning into the senses. So it can be something like hitting a chime and students raising their hands when they can no longer hear it. Or conversely, I've found with some children having their hand up and when they can no longer hear the chime, putting it down. It can also include things for older kids, like throwing a ball up in the air, and when they believe that it's reached its apex, they clap. That's actually a good one for adults for focus, great one for faculty meetings. Or you can use something like a 3-2-1 activity. And I'm going to demonstrate that for a minute, but I'm going to do it much more quickly than I would do it if I were doing it with students. So I will model it, but a little bit incorrectly, a little bit accelerated, so please bear with me. But I'd like to invite you for a moment to participate in this. So I'd like you to kind of settle yourself and look around, and I'd like you to find 3 different things that you can see. Now, I'd like you to listen for 3 different sounds that you can hear. Now, I'd like you to find 3 different things in your space that you can touch. Next, pay attention to 2 things you can see, 2 things you can hear, 2 things in your space you can touch. Now notice 1 thing that you see and notice something about it. Its color, its shape, its size, how light might hit it differently in different places. Now I'd like you to notice 1 thing you're hearing and consider something about the sound, how loud it is. Is it rhythmic? Is it near? Is it far? Now finally, I'd like you to touch something that is within your space. Pay attention to what its texture is. Is it smooth? Is it rough? So obviously, I'm doing this much faster than I would do with students, but I want you to have a sense of it. And I also wanted to give you a moment to take a break from the pace of the presentation before this. Okay, now finally we turn to breath. And I will tell you, for some children, particularly children who've had significant trauma histories, teaching breath can be very difficult, and that tuning into senses may be the best way to go for them. Because as we tune into our senses, our breathing naturally begins to regulate. But if we have a group of kiddos that we can teach breath to, we might want to use one of these 3 types. Now, just like the stress balls, and I kind of jumped into this a little bit earlier, in the general public, we have done it a little bit incorrectly. We've said, take a deep breath. Well, I want you to think about when you're startled. When you're startled, what does your breath do? We suck it in real fast, right? We inhale quickly. We take that deep breath, and that's very activating, just like squeezing that stress ball was activating. Instead, if we're going to do breathing correctly, we should be focused on the long breath out. Kind of like that breath you do when you get to the end of a really long day and you finally get to be off your feet and you sit down and you go, that's the long breath out. And that's what we need to teach students, and we need to use this language when we teach them breathing. With young children, We can teach them the long breath out concept, and we can also use the concept of belly breathing. And I've provided in your PDFs a couple of Sesame Street links that teach belly breathing to those young children. We can also, and particularly if you or your school is using zones of regulation, you might want to use lazy 8 breathing that's a part of that, where they get to experience something again that's predictable and that they're familiar with. For older kids, I found high 5 breathing because it's so portable, or hand breathing is helpful. So they will breathe, they take their pointer, breathe in as they go up their thumb, and then out as they go a little bit slower down their thumb. Breathe in as they go up their forefinger, pointer finger, breathe out as they go slowly down their pointer finger, etc. So the tips for step 2 is ease that shift. You don't have to do all 4, pick 2, but do them in the order presented here. In other words, don't start with a breath and then jump back to gross motor. Go from the first one presented down to the other. You do not need to do all 4. In fact, that might make it too long. So remember that, keep it short. You want to also remind students that if they're using a fiddle object, if they are using a breath or tune into their senses, that technique, that strategy can be used throughout their life. It can be used when they're debating with a friend over the rules of a game, or it can be used when they're stressed out, maybe over homework or during a test. It's really important that they see these strategies as portable into the whole of their life. And finally, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that we stay away from activation, the big squeeze, or the quick breath, the deep breath, and pay attention to the release or the long breath out. Step 3, the one we often jump over, activating the thinking brain. We can do this through a variety of structures with our students, using things like, it should say choral responding. I believe your handout, I'm sorry, says choral engagement, mistype. It could be an object focus and share. A high school teacher friend of mine, before her students take a test, has them pick up a pencil or pick up something on their desk and think of 3 attributes of it, and turn to a neighbor and share those attributes, and the neighbor shares 3 of theirs. What we're doing at this point is bringing the language centers on by engaging them deliberately, but in something that's fairly simple to do. And so we can also just do a simple response, one word to a question. So it might be turn to a friend and share a word. It might be around the circle. In virtual settings, we might allow kids to respond virtually, or we can have them respond in a chat. So it can be verbal or written, whatever seems to work for your students. And we have a wide variety of activities that we can offer. If it can be category listing, it can be skip counting, things like that, or it can be something that's memorized, a song, recite a poem, a saying. The key to this step is, just like with the physical things that needed to be kept in the skill set of all students, is we need to keep the academic or the cognitive part of this in the skill set with the students. So it needs to be at their mastery level. Remember, this is warm up and we don't want it to be stressful. So it's warming up for the run. It's not the actual run. One of my favorites of the ones that are listed is just a simple category response around the circle, name an animal, or around to the class, the virtual class on Zoom. By allowing passes and repeats and saying that up front, we create a safety net for students that maybe the skill is hard for, or if we misguessed and we thought it was at mastery, but it's not, or for a student who perhaps this day is a little more stressed than normal. It is allowing them to respond and be a part of it, but do it, they're engaging by verbally responding, but they're doing it in a way that's safe for them. Also, we can just do a simple calm response where everybody does that. It's getting the voices heard, getting the voices activated. So now we're at the final step. It's the transition back to learning, or sometimes the transition where we simply need them to be a little more focused, like maybe settle down prior to going to lunch. This is where we want to connect with what's happening next. Just like that, making a few key points if you did it before you went into a meeting to. You can probably think of a lot of things. There's some suggestions here on the slide, like having the students touch the materials they need, get out a material they need, write one idea down, get out a fiddle object that you're going to use if you need to continue to focus. There are a lot of things. You probably have a lot more ideas that you could use. So that's it. When do we use this? That's the 4-step process. When do we use it? My big suggestion is pay attention to when your students tend to be less focused, more itchy, and then put it ahead of those times. You may want to start the day off with a quick reset. It's kind of a gentle or soft landing into the school day, whether they've just signed into Zoom or they've just made their way down the hallway. If you're a middle school teacher, it might be the way you start each class. It's a couple of minutes, but it makes an enormous difference in how settled and focused kids are as they move into learning. It could also follow one chunk of learning before you start in another, or it can be a way to transition from a high energy activity like recess, PE, or lunch to a more focused activity such as we find in learning. I would also advocate a time that doesn't seem, most people kind of wonder why. It doesn't seem like the best time to use it, but I'm going to explain why. If you use it to end the day, you get this bonus, and this is the bonus, and this is the why to end your day with reset. How we leave a place emotionally and physiologically is often how we return to it the next time. If we compare a sense of calmness and focus at the end of our class, students are cued to feel that way the next time they return to us. And that's true even if that place is in front of a screen, seeing our face and the faces of our classmates. When we engage with them remotely, we can systematically begin to associate us as people and our place with a feeling of calm focus and the ability to be ready to be successful. And in all of this, it would be remiss if I failed to mention that this is good for us. As we lead reset, we're able to reap the benefits for our own systems. We model it for our kids, which is great, but we also experience it for ourselves. And remember that synchronicity bonus? We bond more with our kids. There's so much more I could talk about in terms of the benefits and the things that can be built into the process, but we now need to turn to some questions. If you have an interest in investigating this more, there's certainly a lot more detail, no surprise, in the book. But there's more details about the science, about other forms of reset, more guidance on these activities, and lots of complementary practices that create a culture of reset. So now I need to turn to Naya and ask her to help us with question time. And I'm going to turn on my camera. Hi, Naya.
Sorry, I was muted. That was an awesome presentation. Thank you so much. We had a lot of great questions, so I'll get right into it. I remember you talked about stress ball, and someone actually asked, can you recommend any good fidget tools that do not actually distract students?
Okay, and distraction is a big issue. So sometimes when we use glitter bottles and that kind of things, kids get lost in them. So you want something, and I teach kids that they can actually tell us if it's helping them pay more attention or less attention. And I think that's an important conversation to have with them. So this koosh ball can be rolled in the hand, nice, simple. Stress balls, if during the reset process itself, where this is the one I talked about, that it kind of bubbles out, oops, and then you can slowly release it back. But a student can even do that. And once they learn the habit of how to handle this ball, they can do it without paying as much attention to it. So it becomes motor memory, right? Muscle memory. So when we practice and reset really deliberately and we pay attention to the squeeze and then the very slow release, we learn that through that practice, that when I'm sitting in my classroom and maybe my stress is causing me to feel more itchy, more moving, need to move more, I can do this, and I can do it without having to pay a lot of attention to it because it's become something that's a routine that my brain can go to easily. There are lots of squishies out there. Another one that's one of my favorites, but it needs instruction like all tools, right? They're tools, not toys. This is water beads in a culinary glove, non-latex, but fairly strong. And so we put the water beads in there and kids can manipulate them. And I will tell you, there was a young kiddo who was taking a standardized test, and he had one of these, and he said it helped him feel like somebody was holding his hand through it. And so it was very comforting for him, but not filled very tightly so that it's not like a stress ball and dense. But again, when we practice it in reset, when we go to do it other times, we have a habit of how to use it. We also know that we're not supposed to be squeezing these little water balls to break them. And kids learn this and they use it well. There's some simple fidgets like this that also balloon out but have a more sensory focus to them rather than a squeeze focus. And second step, the curriculum's second step references marble mazes. And I've done more larger marble mazes for students, but I even like, I'm kind of digging in my little stuff. There are these that can be commercially purchased that are a little marble that they can move back and forth. And these are nice because they're washable. And in COVID age, we need to have things that are easily washable. I make these out of wool felt, or felt, not wool felt, excuse me, out of felt. And kids use them. But this is less washable and it's a personal item, so maybe it'll be okay during COVID times, but I like that this is more washable. Some kids like the soft sensation of the felt over the net, but they're both options depending on how you want to go.
Got it. Speaking of fidgets, is there someone asked, is there a recommended time students should be using these fidget tools or have them in their hands?
Okay, it depends on what the child needs. So some children will need to have them almost all the time if they're carrying a lot of stress. But my recommendation is, if they are, you might want to consider other forms of the reset where a student can more efficiently settle their system. So we have a form of the reset where a student can go somewhere, do some gross motor activities, walk through the 4 steps. They're guided by those visuals, and they've been practiced with an adult guiding them or teaching them initially, maybe to the whole class. We teach our reset space, which is kind of an augmentation to a calming space. So they go, instead of just going and doing something that is quiet and helps them calm, we're actually building in the gross motor activity, which is more efficient at burning off stress chemicals. So they're gone for a shorter period of time, which of course, as teachers, we want our kids with us learning as much as possible. For some children, having that fidget might just be something that helps them focus. But again, I like to have that conversation with kiddos and say, is this helping you? Is this, to a 7th grader, I'm going to say, okay, are you able to better answer our questions? Are you able to better think with your friends when you're working in a group? Or is it distracting you? And have them reflect on that.
That is awesome. Those are some great examples you showed, and that's really going to help people out. We have another great question. Someone asked, would it be appropriate to use the reset process if the class is kind of hyper, or it seems like the class seems to have more energy than normal?
Absolutely. So it's nice if you can get ahead of that. But if it just happens, maybe you normally would have kids do reset first thing in the morning, but something has happened in the day that has dysregulated them, revved them up more. You can say, you know what, I think this is a really good time that we all reset ourselves. Let's go through it again. And so you can do it in a non-scheduled way and also in a scheduled way. Part of that's reading your students. And sometimes as classroom teachers, we get surprised by dysregulation. It kind of can come out of the blue, but hopefully a lot of times we can anticipate it and plan accordingly.
Awesome, another response. We have another person who asked, could you give a specific example of a one-word response to a simple question / chat under activating thinking?
Okay, so depending on the age of children, it could be something like name a color. Or it could be for older kids, give me an adjective. If we know that's within their ability to do it, and if we include passes and repeats. It could also be another word for water or a type of body of water. You can give different categories and sports. It doesn't even have to be academic. What we're doing is we're getting them to get talking in a focused in response to a prompt, which is getting their brain warmed up.
Nice, awesome. Another question we got was, how can we incorporate smells into our classroom and for remote kids?
I'm sorry, I missed the first part. How can we
incorporate smells into the classroom and also for remote kids as well?
I'm missing the one word. I apologize. It keeps on cutting out.
Incorporate. Smells.
Smells. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay. Smells. Smells are interesting because for some kids that really helps them focus. For other kids, it may be distracting or they may consider it unpleasant. Smells tend to be a little bit idiosyncratic for all of us. And if smell is one of the strongest senses, Smells will transport you very quickly across time and space. So when I think about smells, I want to consider the fact that for one child, what is pleasant might not be pleasant for another child. So that, and smells, if we're using them in a whole class thing, could perhaps impact kids differently. So I'd be inclined to use that more in it as an individual thing with an individual child, and allow them to pay attention to that sense, particularly if they have identified already a smell that is very positive for them. And so if it's something that helps them feel calm, helps them feel good, then introducing that smell for them in their own personal reset process and individual reset would be very valuable.
Awesome. Another great answer. Another question we got was, how long does this entire process take?
Okay, 3 to 5 minutes. It takes a lot longer to explain it than it does to do it. And especially as you get more fluent with it. First, it might, because you're thinking about it a lot, it might feel like it takes, or it might take a little bit longer, but you want to choose and not stay in activities too long. You move through the steps, but you do it smoothly. So if we're doing a physical movement, if we're all doing marching in place, then we stop and we hold a position. We've then transitioned from step 1 to step 2, and then we may then sit down, and now we may go around and share a word. So the key is to not spend too much time on any singular step when we're doing whole class. For other forms, we have some other kinds of guidelines, and we're checking in with the student to see how they're doing if it's an individual form. But for this one, it's kind of the flow that's important. We do a few activities. You do 2 with the first thing. You probably do 1 or 2 with the next, and then you go into maybe 1 around the circle, and then you move into making a plan. So we're not laboring over any individual one. This is a way to teach proactively and positively a set of skills that they can then use other times, and times where we might need to explore it a little more deeply or spend more time in each step.
I'm going to ask one more question just to be conscious of everyone's time, but we get a lot of great questions, and you're giving us some great responses. Another person asked, once we return to school, how can we help students continue to de-stress using the reset process?
Okay, so if you've been using it virtually, you are so far ahead of the game. And it might feel a little more contrived virtually. It might feel, and you might have a lot more kids stepping off camera, as I mentioned, particularly older kids. But I think as they hear it, as they get used to it, when you return to class, it not only is doing what it does for them and their brains and bodies, but it is a familiar practice. And one of the things we know when we're experiencing a lot of stress is that predictability is key. Being able to know what's coming and understanding what's coming. So it can be something that is so portable from virtual to in your real class, and it's a familiar. And so it's very soothing for them and will enhance calmness even more. The fun thing will be to explore that when you're together, how does it look different? What are some different things that we can now do that maybe didn't work as well virtually? What are some things we did virtually that we might hang on to in case we're virtual again, and we'll come back to them? So having them see that they can use the same practice both places is really important for them to see it as a portable practice, not something that's a standalone that happens only in this place this time.
Awesome. So if you haven't started using it already, you should definitely start so you can have that head start before you go back to school. That was awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much for those great responses. We're going to head over to the next slide. Thank you, everyone, again, for those amazing questions.
And thank you, everybody, for listening and being here.
Yeah. Everyone watching this webinar, you will be able to download a certificate of attendance. Everyone watching live, you can download a certificate from the handouts pane, and your live attendees will also be emailed their certificate 24 hours after the presentation. Just a reminder that you will be prompted to complete a short survey at the conclusion of the presentation. We would love to know what you thought of this amazing presentation. And anyone who completes the survey will also be entered to win a free copy of Diane's book. I'd also like to remind everyone that we're offering a 20% off discount on our products, including Dyane Carrere's book, The Reset Process, through the end of January. Anyone who watches this webinar or the recording can use the code COFFEECHATS at checkout to receive this discount. If you're looking for more professional development webinar opportunities over the coming weeks, be sure to visit the Brook Publishing website for the latest additions to our Coffee Chat series. We're hosting chats every Wednesday with our esteemed authors, and we would love for you to join us. And for additional support, you can visit the link on your screen. On this page, you'll find a collection of recommended reading, downloadable resources, and professional development webinars for Brooks and leading organizations. And just one last reminder for everyone watching live, you may download your certificate from the handouts pane. You'll also be emailed your certificate in the next 24 hours. And for those of you who are watching this webinar as a recording, please follow the link on your screen to access your certificate of attendance. Again, thank you everyone who attended. We appreciate you spending your time with us. And Dyane, that was a great presentation. I really liked your examples. I might have to get one for myself. That's awesome.
It works for adults. It really does. I've had a lot of adults be very interested in it too. So best of all. Okay.
My work from home desk. But thank you so much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.